You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zinno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us each and every week. Before we get to this week's story, one of a linguist who spent time eavesdropping and listening into the Taliban through 2 tours in Afghanistan. We'll get to him coming up in just a moment. But first, again, we continue, guys, hitting that holiday season. Make sure you go to hazardground.com first. Click on that Amazon button at the bottom of the homepage. So if you want to do any Amazon shopping for the holidays, go to hazardground.com first. Again, hit that button at the bottom of the homepage. It'll redirect you to Amazon. You can do all of your normal Amazon shop. If you're going to buy for the holidays for yourself, we'll get a percentage of what you guys spend. Then we'll donate a percentage of that back to some of the charities and organizations featured here on the show. Also works on your smartphone, really easy. So if you save all your credit card information, if you go to hazardground.com on your smartphone, it'll redirect it to the app. So it's very user-friendly and easy and convenient to do so from there. Please continue to give us 5-star reviews, thumbs up, wherever you're getting this podcast, wherever you're watching it. Continue to leave us positive reviews. Tell us why you love the show. We certainly appreciate all support. Subscribe to the YouTube channel as well. Hit that like button, smash that thumbs up, and tell us why you love the show. Leave the comments. We certainly appreciate you guys taking part in that as well each and every week. And please follow us on all the social media sites, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hazard Ground Podcast, and connect with us there. If you'd love to get in touch with me, please send an email to producer@hazardground.com, and I will get back to you guys. If you have any guest suggestions, I always love to hear from you guys out there who you want to see on the show. So again, producer@hazardground.com. All right, this week's guest is a former Air Force member who spent just over 5 years in the Air Force. He became an Airborne Cryptologic Linguist, which is a fancy term just for a linguist. He has 2 deployments to Afghanistan. Over the course of 2 tours, listened to hundreds of different hours of Taliban discussions, conversations, and peace and in battle. He's written a book about it that is out now. It's called What the Taliban Told Me. He is Ian Fritz joining us here on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Ian, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Listen, it's a story that grabbed my eye immediately. And the idea that you get a chance to sit here and listen to all of these conversations that, that old saying, I'd love to be a fly on the wall. Well, you were the fly, and Afghanistan was the wall, and you heard a lot more than most people had ever heard. And from that standpoint, again, we'll get more into your journey through it and what you're dealing with afterwards. And the book, again, What the Taliban Told Me, is out now. So very interested to hear this story. Now, at the tender age of 18, you joined the Air Force out of necessity. Why?
So I grew up relatively poor in a pretty small town in North Florida. I didn't get into college out of high school for a lot of reasons, some of them being poor, some of them being lazy. But functionally, once I graduated high school, I pretty much had nothing going for me. I worked at a Chinese restaurant as a waiter, and I could have kept doing that, but that wouldn't have led to like any real life. So I had a recruiter come to my high school in 10th grade, and he had talked about this really cool sounding job of an Airborne Cryptologic Linguist. It's just the title is so, neat. And I remembered that at some point after graduating and kind of just like stewing in nothingness. And I went and found a recruiter and I said, hey, is that a real job? That guy tell the truth? And he said, yeah. And so I went through the whole rigmarole of signing up to do that, pretty much to just be able to get out of the town that I grew up in and get away from the less than ideal circumstances that I grew up in.
What was it about being a cryptologic linguist that an airborne, no less? I mean, you're talking and listening in the air. No, I kid. But what was it about being a linguist that necessarily lured you to it? What sounded so cool about it?
The learning languages part, that someone would pay you to go learn a language. The cryptologic thing didn't really mean a ton to me, other than it sounds like this sexy spy word, like you hear cryptology and you think NSA or like action movies or something. And the airborne thing was just that the way it's pitched, which had some truth to it, is that in the Air Force, at least, there are airborne linguists and ground linguists. And ground linguists are shut up in these, windowless buildings for 10 or 12 hours a day, many days a week. And what they do is really, really important, but it's the opposite of sexy to most people. Versus the airborne linguist, at the very least, you get to fly, which generally means you get to travel. So the idea that somebody would, pay me who, graduated high school and that was it, to learn how to fly in planes and to learn another language was pretty exciting.
Did you take a language in high school?
I took French. I don't know any French. Um,
Did you
I
pass?
I passed because the French teacher at my high school, bless her heart, was an incredibly kind human.
Oh,
Um, Perhaps
not
not,
because you parlez-vous français, obviously.
not at all, because no, definitely not.
All right. Well, I was just kind of curious because again, you get fluent in Dari and Pashto, but take me through your first experience in the Air Force. I mean, like even going to basic training, was it a shock for you, a culture shock?
Oh yeah. I mean I had a basic, the Air Force is, we don't call it boot camp, right? It's basic training. Like it's nothing compared to any stretch of imagination like the Marines or even the Army. But there is, lots of yelling and lots of trying to break you down and scare you and all that. The immediate moment that I like had my sort of like Dorothy Wizard of Oz was the my training instructor, came up to me and he's this very scary human, and he says, "Oh, where are you from?" And he's screaming it, but he says, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Oh, Lake City." And he like punched the locker behind me and he said, "Lake City where?" And I grew up my whole life in Florida, and like in my mind, I was still, if I said Lake City, you knew where I was because I was still in Florida, even though I was in Texas by that point. So suddenly the world got like much bigger, much faster.
Oh, okay. So he wasn't from Lake City, Florida. He's from Lake City, Texas.
No, I mean, he's just like, what? Why are you giving me the name of a town that I've never heard of?
Oh, okay. I got you. All
No,
right.
like I didn't say the state. I should have reasonably said, "Oh, I'm from Florida," but I grew up in such a small place that, like, well, of course you're from Florida because everyone's from Florida because we're all here. It never even crossed my mind to specify, the fact that I was from a different state.
Was there anything physically demanding about the basic training experience for you?
For me, yeah. So I had to lose 40 pounds to even join the Air Force.
Wow.
I was really overweight. And so I think there's like an initial PT assessment or whatever. I did 11 push-ups maybe. Like that was all I could physically do.
Wow.
My knee hit the ground. So that was the hardest part for me, was the physical stuff, because I was not at all physically fit.
All right, so you signed this contract to be a linguist. When you get through basic training, do you feel like, hey, the hard part's over?
No, no, you get told going in, I think the fastest you could possibly become an airborne linguist is like a year and a half if everything went really smoothly, and if you had to learn Spanish because it's the shortest language or one of the shortest languages. But it's a 2 year, like the average number is 2 years to do the job. So
I,
you
I
get
mean,
told.
I
So
guess I mean, did you feel like you had cleared the hardest part for you?
no, you get told a lot that language school is going to be incredibly hard and has this really high attrition rate and all that. And I was very excited about that, but I was definitely anxious about that because you're just told time and again that like most people fail out.
How quickly after basic training do you get to language school?
Not too quickly for me. So let's say I graduated basic training in March, and I got to language school in late June or July, I think,
March of what year?
2008.
Okay. So you signed up already knowing what was going on in the world and everything else. I mean, was combat something that you were interested in? Is that the right word to use?
It probably is the right word, but definitely not. So when the vast majority of airborne linguists in the Air Force fly on a plane called the Rivet Joint, or the RC-135 Rivet Joint, which is stationed out of Omaha Air Force Base, or Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska. And the Rivet Joint it's a jumbo jet. It's like a 747, huge spy plane, many hundreds of millions of dollars. And it flies really high, like 30,000 feet, multiple hundreds of miles an hour. And it just does these giant, giant tracks and can collect sort of electromagnetic information from everywhere, which is not, you might say, well, you're deployed and you're flying over, Afghanistan or Iraq or what have you, but it's not combat. If I had asked anybody, hey, as an airborne linguist, am I going to see combat? They would have laughed me out of the room, right? It's just like not the nature of the work. So I don't think at that time, I didn't have strong feelings like pro or against the idea of combat. It just wasn't anything that crossed my mind because it wasn't supposed to be something that I would do.
Gotcha. Okay. Supposed to being the operative word there.
Mhm.
But when you get to language school, do you know what language you want to do, or is it given to you, or how does that work?
It's given you. So I don't know how it works now, but when I was joining, my recruiter said, yeah, you get to choose, or at the very least, he said, you get a preference, and you do get to make a list, right? So for whatever reason, I put Russian as my number one language, and then I don't know what I put after that. But after basic training, you do a very short class called Aircrew Fundamentals. Like everyone who flies in the Air Force has to go through it. And it was there that I got assigned my first language, which was Dari. And I immediately said, what the fuck is Dari? Like I had no idea what it was. I'd never heard of this language. And I had to go find someone to tell me, what it was and where it was spoken.
That's crazy. How did that question go? Who did you go find? I'm just curious because they must have looked
There
at
was
you.
there was a guy at the schoolhouse who he had been in Dari at language school, and I had heard of him, and someone reminded me, hey, specifically it's that guy. So I went and found him, and I was like, dude, what is this? And he had finished the course, but he hadn't passed the final exam. And so to his mind, it was very difficult, and it is difficult. But he was just like immediately like, it's terrible. You're gonna have to learn all this crazy stuff. It's incredibly difficult. You're gonna have a terrible time.
That's a great motivation right there.
Yeah.
So how does you have to take because I am completely unaware of how language school goes. I mean, I took Spanish in high school. I took it in college for a year and then placed out of it because I was yo hablo español mucho. But beyond that, I don't know how language school works for the military.
It's a like fascinating and incredible institution. So it's the Defense Language Institute, or DLI. It's in Monterey, California. It is technically on an army post, but it's really a DoD wide institution, with the exception, I think, of the Coast Guard. But so you have everyone there: Army, Marines, Navy, Air Force. There are a few thousand students at any given point in time, and they teach, I don't know, at least a dozen languages at any given point in time. But the way it works is that it's functionally a job, right? You're in the military. The military owns your body, owns your mind to some extent, and so you go to class 5 days a week, 7, 8 hours a day. You have homework after that. You have much more homework on the weekends. You are pretty much told that you are only going to speak the language that you're learning when you're at school. That's not like necessarily possible at the very beginning. You would be mute, right? You don't know anything. But eventually that becomes true, that you like only speak in that language when you're learning. You're taught by all native instructors, or 90% native instructors. There are some military language instructors for like military type lessons, but otherwise you're getting taught by natives from whatever country of origin of the language that you're going to learn.
Where
So,
is where is your native from?
so all my teachers were from Afghanistan.
Got it.
um, different parts, north, south. They all spoke Dari, obviously. A number of them also spoke Pashto. A number of them also spoke Urdu. Some of them spoke Hindi. They all had some knowledge of Arabic because of the nature of Dari. So yeah, they come from all walks of life, at least in these sort of smaller languages. So I had professors who, before the Taliban, were in medical school, or were doctors, or were lawyers. I had a professor who taught at the Sorbonne in France at some point before he made it to America. So they're not all just like language instructors. They're people who've had fascinating lives who then wind up teaching language.
Yeah, I guess when you think about it, like, if someone asked us to teach English, you'd be like, yeah, I don't want to do that, but I theoretically could. If that was the only job that was available, I could go teach English to people who can't speak English.
Right.
So yeah, I guess that makes sense. I mean, a plumber could teach English if they can speak, theoretically. But neither here nor there. So, all right, you get immersed in Dari. Well, this is a big picture question because I know this. I mean, I know me. Like I've always been good at speaking foreign languages, right? I mean, I grew up with Italian. I took Spanish, and they're very similar. But I've always had just one of those skills you pick it up rather easily.
Mm.
So in my course of my first 12 plus months in Baghdad, by the end of that tour, I wouldn't call myself fluent, but I would call myself able to just be able to communicate. Like I could speak to an average Iraqi Arabic speaker and get through a sentence, probably fairly broken, right? To their, like we would call broken English, would be broken Arabic to them, but they would understand what I meant and got the point of just because I'm living in it right now. I have an interpreter and I'm speaking with Iraqis every single day. If you're aware and you just start paying attention, you hear things, right? You just start to pick it up. I say all that to say, that when you look at Arabic and all the dialects of it are insane. And I would remember my interpreter telling me relentlessly, like, that dude is from here. I can tell in his accent. I can tell in his voice. That guy is not from here. And he would be like, nope, that's going to give him away. If he has to speak, it's going to, like, they would tell me these things, that the dialects, and just sort of the prose, if you will, the syntax of the way they speak is so, so much of a giveaway to where they're actually from. When you just mentioned Dari, Pashto, Hindi, and all the other ones, I mean, Afghanistan is twice as big as Iraq. Um, how do you learn all of those dialects, or do you have to?
So Arabic is much more complicated on that front than Dari or even than Pashto, really, right? Because Arabic, it's right, you have Iraqi, Yemeni, Lebanese, Egyptian, Moroccan, right? You've got totally different countries spread across thousands of miles that have developed that language over time. So like Arabic linguists in the Air Force, they all learn modern standard Arabic, which is functionally like Quranic Arabic or news Arabic. And then, yeah, they have to go learn all these dialects if they want to work in a certain place. Dari, not so much, right? So Dari is just, it's spoken predominantly in the northern part of Afghanistan. And it's probably closer to like, if you have a Southern accent versus if you have a New York accent. Like you could say, oh, okay, it's the same language. It's not a dialect. It's just certain people from different places sound different.
Right.
Pashto is a different story. Pashto, you get into like, oh, okay, you're from here. You're from here. You pronounce words completely differently. Like letters sound different in this language. That gets much more complicated. But for Dari, it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, because that's the hard part. I would think. I mean, again, I've learned Spanish. I can speak it very well, but like when someone it's not their native tongue, and so, But I guess as a linguist, are you actually doing any interpreting or at all? No, right? And so yeah. I guess in the big picture, because I want to get into the nitty gritty here, but in the big picture, it's like when you're listening into a conversation, are you able to pick up those dialects and understand where people are from? Or are you just more focused on the words themselves and the content of what
I'm way more focused on the content, specifically in the job that I did, because my job was all tactical, right? It was all over firefighting stuff.
Okay.
There are other linguists who had more strategic type positions. They would have to know that kind of stuff. They would have to be able to say, oh, well, yeah, I'm listening to this guy and he's talking and he's probably from this area and that matters because blah, blah, blah.
It's interesting. Again, I'm learning a lot here. So, and I just because I know how many different dialects of Arabic there are, that I was just curious if it was the same for you. So you dive into Dari here. Your first day, I'm curious, like, did you realize, boy, this is not the language. I don't want to do this anymore.
No.
Okay.
I have. No, I never had that. So I've always been like, I didn't necessarily do all that well in high school, but I've pretty much always been a huge nerd. And very specifically, I've always been a nerd about language. Like I can respect math and I love science. I studied biology after the Air Force, but I've always loved to read. I think I've always just loved words and sounds. So it was intimidating for sure, right? So Dari uses you obviously have seen and maybe even tried to copy the Arabic alphabet, which is 26 letters, but each of those letters has 3 forms, or almost each, right? They have a beginning form, a middle form, and an end form, depending on where they are in the word. Dari has a few more letters in Arabic, but it's based on Arabic. And so you get told on day one, like, hey, you have to memorize this 90-letter alphabet. And you need to know it by like tomorrow or the next day. And then you need to be able to write it very soon. And it's very intimidating, absolutely. But for me, there was never a point where I was like, oh, I don't want to do this because of the language. There were parts where I didn't want to do it because of the Air Force, but that's different. The language part itself was always very exciting to me.
Yeah, I do remember that at least in Arabic, that one word had multiple different meanings. Like
there's that too, for sure. Arabic is
like the number 2 in the month February were the exact same word because it was the second month of the year. So context meant everything in the language, right? Am I hitting it right?
Yeah, I mean, Arabic is fascinating that way because it's so old. And it was part of so many empires and it's like developed so complicatedly, right? Like you can go and look up, it's fascinating. The name is Assad, right? It's an Arabic name, maybe it means lion on its face. But if you go and look at they make these like name dictionaries, it's like a 500 word description of like why Assad means what it means and the whole context and this history behind the word. Farsi Dari have that to some extent, but I don't think it's not nearly as complicated as Arabic.
Gotcha. So there was no point that you questioned doing this. What was the hardest point of language school for you?
It's probably, I think it's like the first. So Dari is it's written down as like it's 47 weeks. I mean, you spend a year there because of vacations and that sort of thing.
It's insane.
Yeah, I think the first 10 weeks, I think for most people, I don't have like hard numbers on this, but it feels true, is the hardest because it is the most overwhelming, like
Right.
data part. It's just how many vocabulary words are you learning every day? How much new grammar are you learning every day? How many new sounds are you trying to learn how to make? How many new sounds are you trying to hear? The first 10 to maybe 16 weeks are really, really difficult. And then after that, as long as you've made it that far, you weren't, just like struggling every day, it becomes you have a good foundation and you can build upon that.
You mentioned the high attrition rate. When did you start seeing people fall out?
4 or 5 weeks, something like that.
Like they just tap out and say, "Hey, I'm done with this," or the school tells them, "Hey, you're not going to get this. You're out of here."
A little bit of both. I think I remember one guy in my class tapped out. It wasn't necessarily clear if it was like ability or he really just didn't want to do the job, kind of like you were asking about.
Right.
Another guy I know, I think he made it to 8. He was incredibly, incredibly smart dude. Super, super mechanically gifted. Like sounds were not his jam. Like one of the smarter people I've ever known in my life, but could not do language. And I think that those people, do exist. And therefore they can pass the test because they're very smart, the test to get into language school. But once they get there, it's sort of, too much for the way their brain is wired.
Now, 47 weeks. Did you get Dari and Pashto in 47 weeks? You had to go back for Pashto.
No, I had to go back for Pashto. Yeah.
So I do this twice.
I did. Yeah. I consider I was lucky to do it twice. But yeah, some people might say I had to do it twice.
You were lucky enough to do it twice. So two times 47 weeks.
No, so Dari was a year. I went off and I went to my station and then I got sent back to my Pashto. Pashto at the time was a year. It was another 47-week class. It's since been upgraded to a 63-week class because they realized it was probably too difficult to teach in a year. That said, I learned Pashto in 6 months because I went through an accelerated class, and knowing Dari makes learning Pashto much easier.
Gotcha. Is it the reverse same? Does knowing Pashto make Dari easier?
Yeah, there's probably like a 20 to 30% vocabulary overlap.
Right. Like Italian and Spanish. All the Romance languages, all the Romance
Yeah,
languages.
yeah. Like even if it's not an exact, one for one, word for word,
The root of it. Yeah, there's a root of it. And you understand it. All right. So in between Dari and Pashto, is that where one of your deployments occurred?
No, yeah, I had to learn Pashto to deploy. So in between, I graduated language school summer of '09. I had to go. I'd already been to survival school once. I had to go back to survival school for more advanced courses. You have to go to the cryptology school. It's in Texas, West Texas, on Goodfellow Air Force Base. For that, that school is dependent on your language. So if you go there for like Russian or Chinese or something, you're there for a long time and it's like very intense. For Dari, you're not for very long and it's not very intense. I had to do that, and then I had to do water survival. And then I got to my station, which was Hurlburt Field, which is down in Fort Walton Beach, Florida. I got there in like November of '09. And functionally what happened is that if you learn Dari and you go to Omaha to Alfred Air Force Base, where most linguists go, you're useful, like you can do a job. If you go to special operations, Dari is not so useful because the Taliban, probably 90% or something like that, they all speak Pashto. So yeah, you know a language of Afghanistan, you know Dari, but you're not really going to be able to help in a firefight on an AFSOC mission. So the unit didn't necessarily have control over the linguist that they were getting, right? Somebody in much higher level Air Force sent me and my best friend to Hurlburt. And the unit was like, well, you got to learn Pashto. And it just so happened that 6 months later, there was an opening. The Army had developed this sort of short abbreviated course back at DLI, and my unit somehow finagled my best friend and I to go to that.
Good old special operations, huh? And oh, by the way, Fort Walton is like not far from Lake City.
No, yeah, I joined the Air Force to get out of Florida, and I got stationed like
An
four and
hour
a half
and a half
hours.
away? How
It's 4.5 hours. Florida's really, really big.
I know. Well, you go into the Panhandle, but isn't Lake City like right below where Georgia and Florida are? Like just
Yeah, but it's so far to the east.
the
You have to
east.
go. Yeah, like Fort Walton is Central Time. It's like under Chicago.
Oh yeah, that's right. Okay, yeah, I guess so. But anyway, I just thought that was ironic.
No, it's funny. It's very funny.
All right, so you go back to end up past you. Like, did you know you were going to a special ops unit or immediately or no?
It's the same thing. You get assigned a language. At the end of your language school, you get assigned your duty station. And so there was a day where we had to use government computers to do it, and we're all just hitting, refresh, 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 trying to find out where we're going. And we didn't know at the time. What my best friend was told later is that he and I got sent to Hurlburt because we had both signed longer contracts. All of our classmates had 4-year contracts, so they all got sent to Omaha, but he and I had longer contracts, so we got sent to special operations.
Gotcha. All right. Pashto, then back to Florida after that?
Yeah, back to Florida to learn how to fly.
What? What? Damn, man. I mean, the government, you're expensive. The government put a lot of
it is wild. Yeah, it's pretty nuts.
I mean, dear Lord, when do you find out you're deploying?
Probably January, February of 2011. Like I knew it was coming up soon because I was in my flight training, and it was basically as soon as I'm done with flight training, I'm going.
Where are you going in Afghanistan? Do you know?
Kandahar.
Okay. What are you? I normally ask what your mission is. I know what your mission is. It's to listen to people talk. But I mean, in what realm and what support function are you doing it for?
Yeah, so I learned how to fly on AC-130Us, which are very famous gunships. Yeah. When I got to Kandahar, the AC-130, there were AC-130Us down there.
Specify 1 second. When you say learned how to fly, like you were just a passenger, right?
Yeah. I'm not on my plane.
You're not a pilot, like it.
Yeah.
I learned how to sit on an AC-130 gunship. Yes, noted. Got it.
I learned how to sit on an AC-130 gunship, and I learned how to talk to the members of that gunship. Yeah.
There you go. Okay.
But when I got to Kandahar, there was a sort of, the gunships are very old. And so the Air Force at the time was developing the next generation model. And there was a plane called the MC-130 Whiskey, which was the prototype for the next generation of gunships. And so gunships only fly at night. Traditional old school gunships, they only fly at night because they fly very low and they're very easy targets. One of them got blown up in Iraq and a bunch of people died. And so after that, they said, we don't fly during the day. The Whiskies flew higher, so they could fly during the day. And as you can imagine, that means they were in pretty high demand. Like there's lots of ops that go on at night, obviously, but there's also tons that goes on during the day. And the idea of having even a pseudo gunship or gunship light overhead during the day was highly attractive to the guys on the ground with good reason. So like you said, I learned how to like sit on a plane. So very quickly, it takes a couple of flights. I got cross trained to fly on the Whiskey, and so that's my entire first deployment. I flew on the Whiskies.
Okay. What is it, when they grab you and say, hey, we're going out on a mission, kind of take me through what you're supposed to do.
Yeah. So flying is a very cush life. It's pretty rare that someone's going to walk up and like grab you because you have crew rest and all these legal restrictions. But, so usually what happens is the day before a mission, when the mission is going to be, right? Because you have to know when you have to sleep and when you have to be ready. So you find out the night before, mission's going to be 0400 tomorrow. Cool. You wake up, you go, you get a mission briefing. So like weather, because flying, weather's really important. Intel, what's been going on in the area. And then obviously what the mission is. So sometimes we could get, say, hey, we're going on a recon mission. We're going to escort a convoy or something like that. Or, hey, we're going to some FOB because guys out there have been taking pot shots from the Taliban or something. And then you go, you get all that briefing, you go out to the plane, take off, fly for however long it takes you to get there. And then you just circle overhead. So you just fly overhead wherever the op is going to be. Or if it's recon, right, you're flying like a zigzag or a line or slow circle forward. And I am just listening to all the radio chatter that I can find, and trying to figure out which of it's important, which of it isn't important. And then if it is important, so like let's say I'm on an op and a firefight happens, then my job is to relay what I'm hearing to the interested parties. So sometimes that's a plane, sometimes, but usually that's the guys on the ground, because what I'm listening to is very, it's all just ticks. So if I'm listening to a tick, I need to tell, usually it's the JTAC on the ground, hey, Taliban's over here. They're planning to bring in this weapon, or they're planning to, flank you and attack from this side, or they're getting reinforcements, or what have you.
That's amazing. There's a lot there for me to chew on. Number one, you said whatever you can find. I mean, I just, without getting too technical, I assume you have some sort of radio frequency that you're just scanning. I mean, how do you know what you stop and listen to versus what you don't? Like, I keep thinking of like the FBI listening into the mob, but they know exactly who they're looking for. Like, you don't know who you're looking for to listen to. So, I mean, are you looking for keywords? Are you looking for them to say a name? Like, how do you understand what you're supposed to be looking for? You're looking for a needle in a stack of needles.
Often, yeah. I mean, if you were to do this like right now, like in Gaza or something, it'd be absolute wildness. In Afghanistan, there's a ton of radio traffic for sure, even especially during the day. But
I assume you can get cell phone transmissions too, right? Like people on their cell phones and calling.
I didn't know.
Oh, really?
I only listened to pretty much just like icon chatter.
Okay, got it.
The Taliban in battle, they just use push to talk radios. That's it. So that's what I'm looking for.
Very primitive of them.
Effective too, though, man. I mean, that's what JTACs are using, right? Just fancier push to talks, but it's instantaneous more or less. So it's pretty efficient. That's what I'm listening to. How you figure out what to pay attention to is pretty much context. So I give an example of it in the book. It's like if you hear a guy say, "Hey, yeah, I need you to get the truck for tomorrow." Well, that could be a dude talking about, a whole village has one truck and everybody uses it. And it's like, okay, I need it tomorrow to transport whatever, my opium or some food or whatever. It could be like a construction guy because I was flying during the day, right? So it could be guys saying, hey, I need, the company truck or whatever. Or it's a Talib saying, I need the truck that, has all of our AKs in it, something like that, right? Or I need a truck because we're going to drive in and attack some fob tomorrow. But all I would hear is, hey, I need a truck for tomorrow. Like, that's it. And then you say, well, okay, some of it's just like gestalt, I don't know. That doesn't sound like a bad dude. That sounds like a bad dude. Or some of it's, if I'm in the middle of nowhere and I hear that, is different from if I'm like flying near Kandahar and I hear that, right? Near Kandahar, there's like the base, there's a ton of trucks, there's a ton of traffic. Like, okay, it could be anything. I don't know. If I'm in the middle of nowhere, it's probably more interesting. And so a lot of it's on the job training, right? I learned languages and I learned Pashto quite well in language school, but that's language school, right? I'm reading the news and stuff. I'm not listening to dudes talk about how they're going to, ambush Americans or Brits or whoever. So there's a lot of on the job training of like, okay, this is relevant. This isn't relevant. Here's why I feel this is relevant, or here's why this is relevant.
I mean, I'm trying to just, you have no view of what's going on the ground. Right?
You do. So gunships, right? Gunships have pretty fine sensors, and the Whiskies, because they're the next generation gunship, have very, very good sensors. So they have very good cameras.
So you can see, theoretically what's going on. So when a guy says, I need the truck, is there a chance you can see what truck he's talking about? Or
I could say at least, hey, look for a truck, right?
Got it.
If I say, hey, look for a truck, and the dude says, oh, yeah, we're headed to village blah, and we look at the truck and we look at its heading and we say, oh, yeah, that's going to a village. Oh, okay. Probably the dude I'm listening to.
The amount of contact, and you talk about the on-the-job training. I mean, how often were you wrong when you first started? Like, I don't say that as a pejorative. I'm just curious, until you learn the context of really what's going on in the lay of the land, you don't know what you don't know.
You don't. So my very first mission actually was overhead, like one of the largest battles in Afghanistan. I think it was the 82nd Airborne's largest battle since Vietnam. Like they have that in writing somewhere. There's a video of it. It was in this valley called Barawala Kalai. Like 100 Talibs were killed that day. and 6 Americans died, and a fair number more were injured. Basically, just the Taliban had just said, "Screw it, we're gonna ambush this fob." Right? It was over in the Valley of Death, and it was a huge, huge firefight, huge battle. And because it was my first flight, I was flying with an instructor, and we were both just like, "What is going on?" There's just so much happening. Some of it's that where we were, the accent's really hard, but some of it's also just like you're listening to how you don't even know how many people, they're not talking, right? At that point, they're like screaming the same way that like the, guys on the ground are screaming at each other because you're in the middle of a firefight. Not only is it loud, but adrenaline. And so thankfully my presence wasn't like super necessary for that. Like I didn't get anything wrong and like no one died because of me. But I also probably didn't contribute that much because it was like, what's important, what's not, how do I decide that? Who do I even tell? It was pretty wild. Fortunately, my missions after that were like not that crazy. Um, but I was certainly wrong. The language training isn't perfect. You're not perfect. The equipment's not perfect. It's very easy to miss things. It's just sort of the nature of the work.
How do you know when you have a piece of information that's actionable?
Mm, it's really easy if there's a fight going on, right?
Well, yeah, that part. I mean, was there ever a scenario where you got information before something happened that you were able to use?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Ambushes or there's an IED there or what have you. Yeah.
So, okay. So can you give me like an example? Can you sort of
Yeah. So
details?
you're doing recon for convoy because you have to go out to some village or whatever because they have some mission out there, and get some traffic. Like you hear some dudes talking that they're tracking this convoy, right? So that's pretty immediately suspicious. Generic person in Afghanistan isn't keeping track of the position of MRAPs. Like that's not what they're interested in. In fact, they're probably very far away from the MRAPs because that's bad news. Dudes are saying, they're here, they're here, they're here. Hey, you guy who's a few miles up ahead, check on where it is. Like they're coming, they're coming. And then you'll hear somebody say, like, yeah, they're coming, get it ready. It's like, get what ready? And if it's a convoy, it's pretty obvious, right? The most reasonable way to attack a convoy is with an ID. Because you don't have to aim, it's already laid out, you just have to wait for the
Right.
trigger, or it's just going to be detonated by pressure. That or one time I gave heads up there was going to be like a machine gun ambush. They sort of had one ready and they knew the Americans were coming or the team was coming. I don't remember if it was Americans or not. I mostly worked for Americans, but they knew the team was coming, and they were going to light them up with a pretty nasty machine gun. So I was able to tell them ahead of time. Fortunately, that didn't happen.
I mean, is there any satisfaction in that? Is that like the? I mean, how do you I mean, you're doing your job and you're doing it well, but it's just like, what is it? What does it equate to you at that point?
For stuff like that, it's pretty, pretty immediately satisfying of like, well, maybe I just saved some lives. Like that's cool.
Right.
It's a good thing. There's a lot of times though where it wasn't because sometimes something's going to happen, but it's unavoidable. Like you could say, hey, I know for a fact that canyon that you're going to go in is dangerous, but that's just where they have to go. Like for whatever reason, the op requires that the team moves through that canyon. There's nothing to be done about it. All right, cool. I told them it's going to be bad, but it didn't stop it from being bad. Like they still had to go do it, and maybe they get shot, maybe they don't. Whatever. No one wants to be in a firefight, or very few people want to be in a firefight. So sometimes, even though, yeah, you're like, well, I did my job, I did it well. Did it have any meaning? Like, was that meaningless? It's hard to say at the end of it.
What's considered a failure in your job?
Mm, mistranslation, right? If you thought they said A when they actually said B, that can
Okay.
be bad.
I mean, did that ever lead to something bad happening?
Yeah, I mean, you'll think they said we're going to be on the south side, and then they wound up being on the north side, right? That's very different. When you're coming in, if you're coming in from the north, and I told the guys coming in, hey, yeah, they're on the south side, like you'll be good. But they were actually on the north side, they get shot up, right? That's real bad. If I said, there's only three dudes. And it turns out there's 30 because the numbers aren't all that different and they sound weird over the radio or something. But like, yeah, fighting three dudes versus fighting 30 dudes is very, very different.
Did any of those ever happen?
Um, Things like that happen to a lot of people I worked with. I had I had a couple of missions where, yeah, like I missed something, but it wasn't always clear that whether the conclusion was inevitable. Like even if I hadn't made that mistake, there was no way to know that there was going to be a bad outcome. But definitely people I worked with had the misfortune of something terrible going wrong because of something.
How did they handle that?
Uh, Generally speaking, not so well.
Yeah, I'm kind of, is
I mean,
there?
it's like later on in my career in like later part of the story, but to not I'm not trying to be evasive. It's just
I
sort of
don't
like is what it is. Um, a very large percentage of people who did the job I did quit that job or usually had pretty significant mental health distress. Like the Pashto linguists who worked for AFSOC overwhelmingly had severe mental health problems because of the job.
All right, we'll get to that. I do want to kind of discuss that, and I know it's part of your journey as well. You finished that first deployment. I mean, so how do you feel afterwards? Like, I mean, you kind of went through this long road to school, and you finally get down there, and you're doing this airborne linguist thing, and now that it's over, what are your thoughts and feelings?
Significantly more complicated than they were when I went out. Um,
Why?
when I went out, so I turned 22 like a few days into my first deployment. So I was very young. I was very gung ho. I'd spent so long in training, right? It's like, when am I going to do my job? When am I going to do my job? And when you work for special operations, right, you get told what you do is super important. Even if you're not told it's important, you're told it's like cool, sexy, neat, whatever. Um, those things weren't necessarily untrue, but they do place a large burden on you, right? To think, am I living up to that expectation? And so I was very excited to do the job, partly also because the people who came before me and linguists who came before me had been, kind of worked to the bone. And it's like, well, I can help, right? These are my friends, like I can help relieve them to some extent. By the end of my first deployment, I was significantly less gung ho. It was harder, it was much harder to see sort of the purpose of not just what I was doing, but like the entirety of the war in Afghanistan. So 2011, we were after the push, right? In Marja, didn't really go all that well. It was supposed to be this big deal. It was supposed to help turn the course of the war. We did not do that. Right. So I'm coming back to America halfway through 2011, and it's like, where's this going? Like, what are we doing here? Coupled with, what is how, to your question earlier, right? How important is my job? How much am I helping anybody?
Yeah, I mean, all of us at some point, especially when you get back downrange, you'll have that sort of convergence of thought of what did I do and how did it fit into the bigger picture and did we actually accomplish anything? Right.
Mm-hmm.
To paraphrase Abraham Lincoln, it's not in vain, right? Those who perish did not do so in vain. That's what you hope for. That's what you hope, that all that, at least in your mind, can coincide that I did my job. We were successful for a small period that I was there. We both operationally, tactically, and strategically, accomplished the mission. It's not often that those get to align, though. And as you get more distance away from it, you realize that alignment probably isn't what you think it is. That said, you end up having to go back.
Mm-hmm.
Your feeling on going back the second time? Were you excited? Did your first experience sort of jade you a little bit to the whole thing? I mean, what's your mind thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely did. So I got back in early July, in time for the 4th, I think, of 2011. And I went back out October. So I had to go back to like a language training thing somewhere in there for a month. But there was a sense of inevitability, right? Like, as you said, the Air Force spent a ton of money training me. They really did. And so I had to go back out. Sure, fine. That's what I signed up to do. Cool. But there was this big sense of like when you listen to the Taliban as much as people who did my job did, it becomes very hard to imagine that you're going to beat them in any meaningful way. You can say, oh, I'll beat them in this battle. For sure, I will beat them in this battle, right? I'm in a gunship, dude. Like I can lay down a 105 millimeter round on you. What are you gonna do to me? But what, okay, cool, I did that time. Now what? Right? Is the Taliban gonna go away because of that? Are they even scared because of that? Maybe they're scared in the moment, but are they scared enough to not fight again? Definitely not. So it's going back, it's kind of like, okay, well, yes, it's inevitable I have to do this job, but also maybe it's inevitable because we're not going to beat them. Like, is that possible? And that's sort of the question, I think, unspoken, or at least like unrealized. That was the question going through my mind going back for my second deployment.
Did you think that there was any way you were ever going to be able to make a difference?
It became increasingly difficult to believe that. Yeah.
Was there any way you could turn your focus of, at least if I can help the guys on the ground, that's enough?
Yes, I mean, so that was what I had. That is what I did for the majority of my second deployment, because as much as these questions are there, right? On the one hand, it's very difficult to not to think about that stuff during a firefight, right? Like it's like, well, this takes precedence, just sort of by the nature of how the human brain works, right? Like you're paying attention to something, but also like ethically, morally, like I am entrusted to help these people, like these guys believe that I am at least trying to help them. So I better do that, right? I must do that. And so at least through my second deployment, I was able to do that. I was able to focus on the job during the job. But at the time, if I wasn't flying, it was pretty miserable.
Was the operational sort of tempo different on the second one? Were you in more ticks on the second one than the first?
Um, I think it was about the same. The end of my second deployment, I went back to flying on like real gunships on AC-130Us. So that's all flying at night. You're not, doing a ton of sort of recon type stuff. It's like there's gonna be an op. We're gonna go on this op. Gunships shoot quite a lot, right? They're better at it than the Whiskies were. They have more capability than the Whiskies did. So I think realistically, I killed more people my second deployment, but I think that was sort of most of that was like the nature of the plane I was flying on for part of it.
When you say that, you said it matter of factly. I killed more people. I mean, can you give me an example how we got from point A to I killed some people? Like, what the information, I mean, how actionable was it instantaneous? I'm trying to, for the audience, you're trying to get an understanding of a story of how that you can life.
So like there's like a real mission that happened. It's in the book, and so it's cleared by the DoD and all that good stuff. There's an op where there was a team who's going in to talk to a village elder about building a well for the village. And they did that. They talked for like a number of hours and everything seemed pretty hunky-dory. And they were on their way out when they got attacked, right? So all of a sudden, like we're watching through our sensor and it's just like something in a movie, just like bullets are hitting the ground around them and everybody, spreads out. So they're taking cover. They're trying to figure it out. So they're getting shot at a lot. I'm listening to it. We're trying to find the guys on the sensor. We find them. I'm hearing them. We get, when you're firing from a plane, your JTAC pretty much has to give you permission, especially in like a live firefight situation like that. So they call it in, and they called it in, and this mission I was on a Whiskey, so we used Griffins, which are missiles, not traditional like bullets. We fired a Griffin. Griffin went down, hit the two guys who were shooting at them. They blew up. They're dead. And I listened to them the whole time that was happening. I listened to them until the moment that the missile hit them, and then everything went quiet. So that mission, I till my dying day, I would say, at the very least, I helped kill those two guys, and I don't feel bad about that. They were shooting at the JTAC, the whole team. Fine, that's how it goes. Other missions, I was on a gunship mission later in my second deployment. There were some dudes 3 o'clock in the morning. You're probably not up to much good, right? You might be doing something benign, but like probably you're not up to much good in Afghanistan at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Nothing good happens after midnight, Ian. Nothing. Remember that.
Nothing good happens after midnight. Definitely nothing good happens after midnight in the wilds of Afghanistan.
Yes, that is true.
They're doing around some shady shit, and they're doing a bunch of shady shit near a team. and we're not having any of that. It's not daylight, like you can't see them coming. And so we killed 8 dudes. We just laid down a bunch of 105s, a bunch of 40 mil, we shot them all.
From the gunship you were in.
Yeah. So those, it's like that was in the middle of an active firefight. I contributed. I was part of the team. I heard stuff like fine. It's not as if we weren't going to shoot them if I weren't there.
Right.
And so that's, I talk about this book, and just, I don't know if struggle is the right word, but I think about it to this day of like, well, did I kill those guys? Did I not kill those guys? Did I simply help kill those guys? If those dudes were going to die without me, does that matter? Doesn't matter at all. But the easiest way to explain it is like, yes, okay, I was there. We shot them. They are dead.
No, and look, I think and let me just clarify. When I asked the question, and asked for an example, by no means was I trying to say, well, you didn't pull the trigger. That's
oh no, I know that. Yeah,
that has nothing to do with it. And it doesn't have anything to do with, again, there are people I know that are on this earth. I didn't necessarily pull the trigger. I mean, I have that on my conscience, but it's the same sort of thing. I gave the order for you to fire on somebody else, and those dudes aren't there no more. I mean, that's whether you pull the trigger or not doesn't necessarily dissociate you from the event and your role in it. So I just want to be clear for the audience for that sake. By no means, and the audience knows me. They know I wasn't attempting to belittle you or undercut your work or anything like that. I had nothing. I just wanted you to understand where I was coming from with it, because I think it leads to a bigger conversation that we'll get into about mental health and where you are with all this stuff. Because I can only imagine. And I don't want to stray too far from the actual deployment stuff, because I do have a couple more questions. But just to relate a person, I can still hear like radio calls in my ear from when we were in firefights. Like I can remember what was said to me, and I can hear that beep go off, when the radio starts to clap, it starts to go and all that, like little things like that stay with you. And I can only imagine the conversations that still rattle around in your head at times that you heard.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few at least, and they're very strange these days, because it's like, what language are they in, or what language do they feel like they're in? Who is saying what? Sometimes that gets a little bit murky, but yeah, there's a few of them.
Sort of lighthearted question to pivot a little bit before we get back into the heavy stuff. What was something that you heard that seems so innocuous and ridiculous or silly and that just made you giggle, or something like, this guy just crapped his pants, like, I mean, whatever it is, something like that.
There's probably two. One, it's like everybody knew it. Everybody I worked with knew it. I didn't hear it firsthand, and I would never claim that I heard it firsthand, but everybody knew this story, that it's middle of the night, northern Afghanistan, it is cold. And there's 2 dudes talking, and one guy's clearly sort of, the leader, one guy's the follower. And the leader guy says, hey, go put that IED down there. Like, you got to go put it down at, that intersection. We know the Americans are coming tomorrow. And the follower guy is like, but do I have to? Like, very, very whiny, and like, I don't want to. I don't want to do that. And they go back and forth, right? Afghans are very repetitive a lot of the time, and they just go back and forth many, many, many times. Dude, the leader's saying, you got to go do it. And the follower's saying, I don't want to do it. They finally go back and forth, and the leader says, go do it. Like, absolutely gives him a command. And the following guy says, I just can't do it. It's too cold to jihad. Which sounds like something out of a sketch comedy, but is like an actually real story. That it's too cold to jihad. It's too cold for holy war. 100% he was right. It was way too cold for that shit. So that's
listen, I chuckle because, like you said, it does sound like sketch comedy, but I mean, it was the exact opposite in Iraq in the middle of July and August, right? It was too hot to jihad. Right. Like, if it wasn't in place in the morning before the sun came up, wasn't happening at 2:00 in the afternoon.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Those dudes were just either at prayer, or they would just say, hey, it's too hot, I'm not going out today. It's so the Americans will be here tomorrow. We'll get them tomorrow. No big deal. And in reality, it's too cold to jihad. That's hysterical. Those should be T-shirts. I mean, that is outstanding.
Yeah, it's pretty funny.
Yeah, I probably will never forget that for as long. I may drop that on some of my friends. It's too cold to jihad today. But yeah, I mean, it's just, I say this repeatedly. The Taliban, Al Qaeda, they have the one thing in their corner that Americans will never have, and that's patience and time, because they just don't care. They are not on any timeline. They do not care. They never will care. We always will be stuck to a timeline. We got to go, because that's us. And we're very impatient. And those guys are like, tomorrow, inshallah, whenever.
Yeah, I mean, it's baked so much of it is, that like the nature of fate and like divine will. And then for Afghans specifically, Al Qaeda, I think it's different. And I'm no expert in Al Qaeda, but for the Taliban, for Afghans, we beat the Soviets, we beat the Brits. We beat the Mongols. We beat Alexander the Great. I mean, what are you guys going to do? Eventually, you're going to go home. Yeah.
Eventually, yeah. Well, we keep proving them right, though. That's the problem. We keep feeding their ego and telling them that they're right. Even though we all know that they didn't win a lot of those battles on their own, but that's, again, a different history lesson. Because the New York Times doesn't get delivered to the front page of every Afghan village. So they don't really have a fair assessment of accuracy, but nor do they care. On the flip side of that, when you have these moments of levity and everything else, is the other side, there are these moments of just grave trepidation and everything else that go along with it?
Yeah, I mean,
do you hear something that you can't do anything about, and you just know that there's this impending doom happening that you can't stop or affect?
Yeah, so I had a mission. It was like in this like wild valley, just like these sheer cliff walls on either side, and I heard, and it was really scary. Old school dudes, old school Taliban, like they were basically like mujahideen, like from the old like Soviet wars. Like these guys were wild. They were marching down the side of a mountain with like a flag, a banner, which is not what you think of when you think of guerrilla warfare, right? And they at some point, they said, "Hey, go get the big gun. We're going to bring in the big gun." And so that's a Dushka, which is like an anti-aircraft gun. I'm not worried about my plane. They're not using it on my plane. They're 100% going to use it on the guys on the ground. And I know a dude said that, but I don't know where that dude is. I don't know how far away that gun is. I don't know when they're going to bring it in. Maybe that gun's not even like, right. The dude says, hey, bring the Dushka. And I didn't hear the next guy say, oh, sorry, the Dushka's broken. I don't know if that could happen, but I had no idea. And so a lot of that battle for me was waiting to be like, oh, okay, is it going to show up? Is it not going to show up? Is it going to show up? Like, just because they're bad news. So sometimes, yeah.
When that second deployment ends and you come home, do you know you're kind of done with this job? Because you don't spend much more time in the Air Force after that, do you?
I do not. Yeah. I knew I was done deploying for at least a little while, if only because, and I knew this and I told it to people, I 100% would have killed myself if I had to go back and do a job.
Why?
That's a very good question. It just wasn't compatible with life somehow. Like the job was not compatible with life because of the futility of it, the big picture futility, right? Like every linguist I knew, or almost every linguist I knew who, if you'd asked us in 2011, like, was America going to win the war in Afghanistan? We all would have told you no. Absolutely not. This is a waste of time, waste of lives, waste of money. So there's that. But I'm then getting that. You could say that, lots of people can say that. It's very easy to say it now in hindsight because we know the outcome, right? But I like lived proof of that every day, listening to the Taliban say like, no, we're not going to lose. 100% we're going to win. 100% we're going to kill more Americans, more Brits, more Canadians, more whoever. And it's just unceasing, their will to do that. And that coupled with like going out, my first deployment, it was very easy to say, well, they're bad dudes for doing that, right? They're bad dudes for killing Americans, killing Europeans, killing Brits, whomever. But in my second deployment, it's like, but are they? Because some of them are. 100%, right? And for sure, the Taliban is an entity like the Taliban that today in 2023 currently runs Afghanistan. Bad people should not be allowed to have power. The individual Talibs, members of the Taliban that I was fighting, unclear. Many of them are coerced by the big picture Taliban, right? Dude comes up and says, hey, if you don't join us, I'm going to take your wife away. I'm going to kill your cousin. I'm going to take all your food and you're going to starve to death this winter. What am I supposed to do? I could off myself, but like, how many humans are going to choose that decision? or any other version of like why, or the Americans had come in and killed that dude's wife or cousin, or like burned all their opium so that they had nothing to sell to live on. It's like, well, yeah, I'd probably fight back too at some point. Like it's pretty rational. If you took a Texan and you went up and invaded their house at 3 o'clock in the morning and shot their wife, chances are they're going to fight back at some point. And so all of that together is just like, what am I doing? Like, what is this going to result in? And that coupled with, or thrupled with how many missions where I was like, I'm not helping. Like, I'm just watching people die for no reason. So somehow all of that put together, it was very difficult for me to articulate any of that at the time. It was just all this like big jumble of rage and sadness and despair. But I think looking back is probably those are like the main parts of my extreme depression at the time.
I want to follow up on that, but I when you said that you weren't helping, can you give me an example of people dying and you weren't helping? Like
Oh yeah, I mean, it's in the book. So there's much more detail about it, but we had a mission, a small village, or whatever, and the guy JTAC on the ground is like, "Hey, what are those dudes doing over there?" And these dudes they're it's super clear. They're working on some plot of land. It's like, are they farming? Maybe they're farming. I don't know. But the JTAC is pretty convinced that they're like hiding weapons. So long story short, we shot them, dropped a missile on them. They didn't all die. They should have, but something weird happened with the missile. And one dude instantly died. One dude got blown however many meters away, lost his legs. Another dude got blown away another direction. That dude somehow ran off, came back with a wheelbarrow, picked his buddy up, buddy with no legs. And they tried to drive him off to get help. And we were trying to decide whether we were going to shoot the car that they were in, because it was, are they going to go get reinforcements or something? And I was listening to their whole conversation. I was like, no, they weren't going to get reinforcements. They were trying to get help for their friend. And I listened to this dude watch his friend die because they stopped driving at some point. He stopped talking and he's like, never mind. It's too late. Like, we don't have to do this. So, JTAC on the ground, he is much more familiar with threats than I am, right? He knows that he got shot at yesterday. And he knows that Taliban are wily and that they bury guns in fields looking like they're farming. All of that is true. To this day, I have no idea who we killed. Did I kill some civilians? Did I kill Taliban? Does it matter? Mm-hmm. So it's like, what's the point of that? If anything, there's not a good point to that.
No, and that's fair. And I certainly understand and empathize. It's not an easy situation to be in. And for the record and for what it's worth, everybody has a different level of morality about combat. Even though we know right is right, wrong is wrong, and good guys kill bad guys, and we're usually okay with that for the most part. That said, again, everybody's moral compass points in a little bit of a different direction, and where that rests for each individual is ultimately up to them. So I would never, and I hope my audience would never, some people are good. They were probably bad guys anyway, or they probably knew bad guys. You could rationalize anything you want, but at the end of the day, there were times I know that I let somebody walk away because it just didn't feel right.
Mm-hmm.
In my head and in my heart, it didn't feel right. Like maybe that's not what I think it is, and could I have been wrong? Yeah. Could they have gone on to kill another American? I don't know. I can't go down that rabbit hole in my head. But I say all this again to say for you, for what it's worth, that I appreciate your perspective on it. And it's not easy. And there is a certain amount of humanity that more of us probably needed throughout this whole thing. And I'll say this, Ian, on the flip side, I spoke to other guests who, after watching all their buddies get killed and after watching all their buddies get shot, and one by one, everybody around them is going down, there's a certain level of anger and fear and frustration that you take out on the enemy because that's your job. And I understand that too. I don't, and again, the idea that we want to paint some sort of broad brush about combat and the morality of it and what's right and what's wrong for everybody is completely foolish. And it's something that should never be done, because every circumstance is probably different and every individual in each circumstance is different. So my long-winded response to what you were saying was I appreciate your perspective on it, and where you come from. Now, that said, you know, when you decide to get out, was there any sort of questions from anybody? Did anybody think you should stay in? Did you doubt yourself after you made the decision? Did I do the right thing? Like, where are you emotionally with it?
Oh no, it was not well received. To some extent, rightfully so, right? Spent a lot of time training me. I saw time on my contract, signed up to this job. That's all that their viewpoint of it. But the the compressing a fair amount of time into a short version is that, I went to mental health, and mental health eventually was just like, oh yeah, no, he can't do this. Like he's not, you know, he's not lying, or he's not, inflating or something. Like this kid's gonna, something bad will happen if this kid deploys. Right. The I said earlier, like I would kill myself if I deployed again. That felt very true at the time. I can't 100% certainty say that, right? Like there's some courage required to commit suicide, and like maybe I never had that, but I was gonna get somebody else killed for sure, because I wouldn't have been able to do my job at some point. Like I wouldn't have been able to focus, and that seems completely immoral, right? Knowing that like you don't have the ability to do something, and then someone trusts you to do that thing, and you're like, okay, well, sure, I'll give it a shot. Like that is not tenable. So no, my command, my squadron was not very happy with it. They were not happy for a lot of reasons. A ton of linguists who didn't Pashto linguists stopped deploying because of very similar reasons of just like severe mental health problems. So they weren't super stoked about it until things sort of with mental health were cleared up. And then, I got out to go to medical school, and people were very supportive and very helpful. And, people wrote me letters of recommendation, and all that was really great.
Do you think that if you had, let's say you had more time in your contract and you had to go again, I know you said you thought you might have killed yourself, but was there any part of you that felt like, hey, I'm better at my job now, I'm more able to compartmentalize, able to focus, and able to execute the job? I mean, because there's a certain amount of numbness you can turn on, right? You have to.
Yeah. I think on a technical level, I was better, for sure, because like I said, all this on the job training, time listening to people talk is a requirement of the job. So on a technical level, I was better, but that's what I spent most of. I think that's what I spent most of my second deployment doing, was turning on that numbness. And as the deployment was going on, I was like, this is really hard. Like I can't, like not hard, like oh, what was me is hard, no, like physically difficult to do. It's as if I was trying to, squat 100 pounds more than I can physically squat. Like at some point you just can't do it anymore. And that's really what it felt like. Like finishing a second deployment was doing all of that. It didn't help that, all my second deployment, another Pashto linguist who was way better at his job than I was, like way better. He got out there, and a week or two in, he had to go back to America because he was going to kill himself. And he already said that. He said, if you put me on a plane again, I'm going to shoot myself. And so it's like, I'm not alone. At some point, there is solace in that, right? Of like knowing that you're not alone. I can't, for him and other guys like him who had all these feelings before me, it's very lonely. It's very difficult. People didn't listen to them. I had the, blessing of, oh no, there's a pattern here. Like maybe
Yeah.
seriously.
I mean, look, credit to you for recognizing where you were mentally at the time, because a lot of people don't. Obviously, we know that. But I also would say that, there is a, in this pattern, I'm trying to put my finger on the pattern and where the tipping point is, and is it that, again, some people can dissociate from the air to the ground. I've talked to a lot of pilots who pull the trigger, right? Who are the ones who, there's a certain, combat is a lot more personal when you see the guy right in front of you, right? There's a personal nature to it. From 30,000 feet or 10,000, whatever it may be, whatever you're in, even from a helicopter at a couple of 100 feet off the ground, laying down rounds down on the enemy isn't as personal because it happens so quickly and you move on. Was that part of it? Was it, because you could see it all and hear it all, did it make it more personal for you guys?
It's fascinating that this is such an important question. Thank you for asking it. yes, for people who did my job, it was strangely much more personal than for anybody else on the plane, right? Even the sensor operators who are operating those cameras and like watching dudes die because you got to make sure they died, but they didn't like listen to that dude talking right before he died. And so, yes, it was on the one hand very, very highly personal, and that absolutely contributed. On the other hand, we've seen this more and more in the drone community that there are people who have what you would imagine shouldn't be possible. Like, how could you have PTSD over a computer screen? But they do, or at the very least, many drone operators have what's commonly called now moral injury. Of yes, there is that huge distance. Like I sort of firmly have this belief that it might actually be easier to shoot somebody in the face right in front of you because that guy was threatening your life than it is to shoot somebody from the comfort of a plane or the comfort of a drone. The comfort of a drone, you're 6,000 miles away. Because it's like, well, what did that guy ever do to me? I don't know that the human brain is like caught up with the technology.
I think it's an excellent point. I mean, imminent danger and self-defense or preservation or our instincts that we all, possess immediately. There's a sense of playing God that probably weighs more on you than anything else. Like, God never did anything to me. Why do I get to decide if he dies? A lot of us don't want that responsibility. But like you said, I think it's a very, salient point in the sense that, okay, they're shooting at me. I'll just shoot back and eliminate this threat, and I'll put my head on the pillow at night. Whereas opposed to like, I'm not in any real danger. It's kind of like here's a bit, and I'm guilty of this as a kid. It's kind of like, when you launch water balloons into oncoming traffic and they can't see you because you think it's cool, but you don't realize the after effect of what actually could happen. Right. And it's fun. Like, you do stupid things like that as a kid, like, but to the person behind the wheel, when something lands on their car and they jerk the wheel into a tree, you have to deal with the repercussions of that. Right. Like, but you don't really realize it. I think there's some of that where, and I don't know if that's a bad example or not, but I just, there's a whole sense of I'm not really cognizant of in the moment of making the decisions until after it happens. You realize, wow, look at the destruction I just personally took part in.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I think the evidence bears that true because if you go look at veteran suicide rates, they're astronomically high. Fascinatingly, there's higher suicide rates amongst people who never deployed than there are against those who did deploy, which just boggles the mind at some point. Like, that seems okay, maybe there's a whole culture problem. I don't know. I'm not diagnosing it. And I can't say that, but looking at that, just knowing that statistic exists, it begs the question of like, well, why might that be true, right? A drone operator technically never deployed. A drone operator, in my mind, 100% would have a valid reason to at least have suicidal ideation because of the moral injury that is not necessarily part and parcel, but like is very common in their job.
Yeah, I mean, again, I only know the personal level of combat, so I have
right, and I don't know it at all. Like
right.
To a drone operator, they might say mine was personal, but I would look at you and I would say, no, mine was not personal at all.
Yeah, and it's always dangerous. It's slippery slope to do that comparison thing, right? Because it's all different. I mean, I was never trained in that stuff, so I don't know what it is. I guess too, I wonder, do you know if you were listening to the same? How often were you listening to the same people repeatedly? Like, could you tell?
No, for me, it wasn't that often. The nature of special operations and some of it, the nature of when I was there, it was, we would go up here today and over there tomorrow and down here the next day and then back here.
I just didn't know if there was sort of like that Stockholm syndrome, in the sense where you hear the same people having these conversations every day. And even though they're doing wrong, there's a certain amount of like connection you have. Like, hey, I'm like watching this dude grow, like it's almost like, it's a weird
thing. There are other linguists who have that. The ones who do more strategic work, yeah, they will, follow someone. Pattern of life is a term a lot of people know. Developing pattern of life, well, you have to get to know someone's life. So that is, I think, like wildly even more difficult than what I did.
Is there a way to make your job easier and less mentally taxing?
Some of it is technology is limiting. The technology of how we did our job was limiting, and that there were certain technological upgrades that we would ask for that maybe weren't physically possible, or budgeting didn't allow for it, or there's all kinds of reasons. Um,
I mean, I was talking more about in the mental aspect. Is there a way to make? Do you think that like if it was more time in between, because you were going out almost every single day, especially in the special operations community, where like
yeah,
would have a mission, a week off, and then go back out for a minute? Would something like that have maybe mitigated some of the mental stress you guys are under?
I don't think so, because I mean, there's like a lot of details that go into this that maybe don't matter, but the like how flying works and how expensive it is to keep somebody in Afghanistan, like maybe that would have helped. I actually don't think it would have, but like it's an impossible solution. You
Right.
can't. It's just like not the way it would
Well, the only
work.
solution is to get more of you, so you get more of a break,
'Cause,
right?
yeah, the solution is to get more, and that's what they were trying to do, to varying levels of success. But that takes, right. I spent 3 years in training. The fastest you could have made a version of me,
2 years.
the absolute fastest is 2 years, right?
Yeah.
So that's like, what are the people working supposed to do in that 2 years? I mean, unfortunately, I think the the truth winds up being the only way to have made it better would have for it to have been a better war, which it wasn't. Like, so I don't know anybody who's, definitely I don't know of any Americans who are fighting like Ukraine, Russia. That seems pretty, like, on its face, that seems pretty self-evident, right? Russia has invaded Ukraine. Russia is committing mass atrocities against civilians. So if I'm fighting back against Russians, makes sense. Like, I find it hard to believe that you're going to have a ton of, moral questioning around that.
Yeah.
By 2011 in Afghanistan, not so much.
When Afghanistan fell in 2021, what did that do to you?
That's why this book exists, actually. So it was, as
Good
the
transition.
Taliban, yeah,
Good transition. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, as the Taliban was taking back control. So, right, the fall was in August, but there were reports before that going out through the year. So I was in my last year of medical school, and the last year of medical school was like, you don't have a lot going on, actually, especially like the last semester of it. And so I had a lot of time on my hands. And it was also, right, COVID stuff still happening, a lot of time on my hands. And I was just like, for the most part, furious, because the way it was being talked about was, gasp, how could this be happening? Right. Like, there was some, intelligence report that said, oh, the Taliban may regain control in 6 months. And it was more like 30 days. And everyone is just shocked by this somehow. And again, it goes back to, like, you could have asked me in 2011. You could ask most of the people I worked with in 2011. Taliban going to take back control? 100% they are. I can't tell you when. I'm not going to give you a date, because, like, that's unknowable based on how many people are in Afghanistan fighting. But yes, they will. And so I had pretty recently taken a writing course, while I was in medical school. And so I had all these feelings, and I had all these feelings about those feelings, and I didn't know what to do with any of them. So I was just like, I have to write these down, not necessarily for anybody, but just for me to, like, get my thoughts out, right? It's like, basically, it was journaling at some point. But what I wrote down, I discussed with my partner, and I wound up discussing with a couple of professors of mine, and they encouraged me. They said, more people need to hear this. And so I sent the essay into the Atlantic, and they published it like right around when, the Taliban took back Kabul and the bananas withdrawal and everything. And so because of that, a lot of people read that. And so eventually the book came out of that.
Where I'm just curious, and this is only a personal question. Where do you place the blame for Afghanistan?
That's a hard question. Have you read the Afghanistan Papers by Craig Whitlock?
I started to. I never got through all 150 pages, so I got about 30, 40 in, and then
Yeah,
left.
I mean, it's like sort of overwhelming, the amount of data he, had to go through. It probably goes back to politicians who were around sort of mid to late 2000s, I think. I think by the time you get into the 2010s, it was just a lot of inertia. And that has nothing to do with, like, my politics. Like, I dislike a lot of people who were in power at all sorts of times. I just think that, yeah, by 2011, it's like, well, somebody else already put, 80,000 people here. Like, it's really hard to undo that.
And Iraq is no different, for the record. I mean, the best way I heard it phrased was by, like, 2009. We had reached hull velocity in Iraq, and that somebody who was a sailor told me this, that the hull of a ship that ultimately defines how fast it can go, just from an aerodynamic standpoint. So we had reached hull velocity in Iraq in 2009. Nothing was ever good. That was the apex. Nothing was ever going to get any better. It was only going to go down from there. We're never going to find anything better about it. And when I was there for the closeout in 2011, because I had deployed, 05, 06, and then 5 years later, I was there again. And you could tell everything was down. And it wasn't just because we were leaving. It was just because nothing conceivably could have gotten any better. And I think there was a certain amount of that Afghanistan that we ignored for probably 10 years too long.
Yeah, super duper. I mean, the Taliban capitulated. Look at they split. They were a bunch of podunk idiots, man. Like we go in after 9/11 and they were done so fast. But we had this idea that we had to get every single guy, right? And like they had to make a big show of giving in. I mean, I think that some of this is my opinion. I think a lot of it bears out in the Afghanistan papers and other books that if you had to choose a person to blame, you could probably choose Rumsfeld, because he just had this vendetta that was not fulfillable. I think it's a little bit ludicrous to blame a 20-year war on one person. Like that seems kind of wild.
Agreed, 100%.
But the people in that mindset, in that time frame of like 2000, 2001 functional. So let's say 2002, let's be generous, 2002 to 2008. It's like they were lying to the American people. That word is accurate. They were lying. They said things were happening that were not happening. And they were afraid to lose face. They were like, no, we already sunk all this money in. We can't possibly, like, how could we lose to, these farmers in Afghanistan? Which then how many hundreds of thousands of people died because of that?
On both sides.
Yeah, it's wild.
Are you angry about the withdrawal?
Yes.
Are you more angry about the actual exit or just the overall result of the exit?
I think it probably winds up being accurate to say I'm angry about the actual physical exit, right? Like people like seats taking off and Afghans hanging on.
That was botched from day one.
Yeah, so botched. But I think I'm most angry at everything that led up to that. So I'd like to say the year prior, probably, because it's not like it wasn't a surprise. As this is what was so infuriating as I was trying to write this essay out, that people were surprised that the Taliban was coming back. It wasn't a surprise. Like it's in Afghanistan papers, right? The week prior, you had people working in the embassy, just like going around doing their day-to-day work. And it's like, dude, the Taliban just took back the three remaining largest cities in America or in Afghanistan. Like all that's left is Kabul. Shit's gonna hit the fan. And so, yes, like on the granular basis of like that day, those days, of course, it was poorly managed, of course. But it's like it was so foreseeable. That's what I'm really, really mad about. It's like you really could have prevented this.
And the other reason I'm asking these questions, just to be clear to you and the audience, I mean, the moral injury that you talk about, and again, it goes back to the whole, it was not in vain. Well, it kind of all was in vain the way everything had happened. Like I didn't deploy to Afghanistan. I only deployed to Iraq. I've been to Afghanistan several times, but I didn't technically deploy there. That said, I don't have much moral injury about Iraq. Like, Iraq's back to being a mess. We all know that, even though it's not being reported. And, we still have a State Department there of 2,500 people, the largest in the world, which I don't know why, but it's not actually doing anything. Beyond all that, there's not any, I was literally there for the ending of Iraq. So, and I always chuckled about how we told the whole world we were leaving a year ahead of time, and we seemed to get out of there without a scratch on anybody and a single issue. Yet when we told the world we were leaving Afghanistan, all of a sudden, look what happened.
Mm-hmm.
So the dichotomy of those two is not lost on me, but I don't have this big moral injury about Iraq, but I certainly have a lot of sympathy for my friends who are in Afghanistan and people like you when the exit happened, because it ripped off a lot of Band-Aids, man. I mean, it cut open a lot of scars that a lot of people had.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't thought about this till this conversation, but like thinking of this idea of, I think any or almost any individual's actions in Afghanistan, like individuals who served and were military adjacent or whatever, their actions were not in vain. I think the United States policy wound up making what everyone did in vain.
Agree.
completely annihilated any good faith that, we tried to enact for our compatriots, for Afghans, for the global community, whatever. Like they completely undid it. So it's, even if you had felt good about what you did before, maybe all of a sudden you're just like, well, shit, I shouldn't feel good about that. That was pointless.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of the point. I mean, look, no one has a strategic thought in their head when bullets are flying, right? And you almost never have a strategic thought when you're actually downrange. So the whole strategic thought process comes in after you get back and you sit back and you realize and you start to take some big picture values of what was going on, and how effective it was, and you realize, man, that's why, again, it was just like, what do we waste all that time for? What do my friends die for? What do we, if that's the way it was going to end, what do we do all this for? Mm-hmm. Even in the moment, if you were winning a battle, even if the moment you were taking back land, even if the moment you were bringing bad guys to justice, all of that falls under that same umbrella of what do we do it for if we just handed the country right back to them in mm-hmm. less than a week? Mm-hmm. So I understand that, and I get it. In writing the book, how much catharsis did it give you?
A fair amount. I think a lot of the book is stuff I had been thinking about for 10 years, but I hadn't concretized, is the word I keep coming back to, or I hadn't organized even. There were just feelings that I had, and I was able to put them out there. I think being able to, even if only 50 people buy the book or whatever, and they can see some of the incredible work that my friends did, these brilliant people that I worked with, that is like a wonderful feeling. And then if beyond that, anybody else can sort of read the book and look at the complexities of humanity in wartime, that I think is very cathartic. And like the idea that anybody else could maybe hopefully take that away is very cathartic.
Yeah. It's not a conversation I often have with people who haven't been to combat. And if I do have it, it's more of a directive than it is necessarily a conversation. Well, yeah, because again, it's just it's like trying to explain childbirth to me. Like, sure, yeah, that sounds like it's painful, yeah, but I just, it's an experience I don't have, so I'm never really going to be able to as much in my head. Yeah, I can handle it. Yeah, I can tolerate pain. I'm good. Like, it's just right. I don't have a real awareness of it. So from that standpoint, yeah. I will say this, and I mentioned this earlier, it's always dangerous, especially people who've never been there, to try and put morality of combat into context. It's never, there's no one way to do it. It's not cookie cutter. It doesn't fit in a box. You can't wrap it up nicely. There's no bow that goes on it. It is messy and ugly all around.
Yeah. I mean, William Vollmann is it's like mad genius of an author, and he wrote a book on violence. That's not the title, but that's what the book is about. And he's sort of like crazy, but also he's incredibly smart. And his conclusion, he had to write like 3,600 pages to develop a moral calculus around violence. And that's literally, he was like, 6 volumes, it has to be this long. There's no other way that this is possible. So if he's, even if he's like somehow 10% right, that's like 360 pages of wildly well-researched thinking to somehow come to an agreement about like what is right or potentially wrong when in conflict.
What do you want people to take away from the book?
I think that sort of phrase I said earlier about the complexities of humanity in combat, I think so much of detailings of wars often gets very one-sided, and that's, I don't know, just the nature of humans, right? We side with our own.
History is written by the winners. Remember that.
yeah, but that would mean that the Taliban gets to write history. So you better listen to them.
Yeah. And I wonder, and just learning, and this is, again, brand new for me and learning all about this, the idea that your work, because it is pivotal, right? I mean, and again, it goes back to just me having an interpreter and how close I became with him over the course of the whole thing. Because, he sat in the truck behind me and he wore a helmet and a flak vest and carried a gun and, put his own life on the line every single day like I did, because everywhere I went, he went, except for one time. That was a bad mistake on my part. But it's just that whole language thing, in one way, it's so it's a job, but it's such connective tissue, right? Like the idea that you can learn another language and speak to people and I think that's, I'm just wondering how much of the emotional component is that, or maybe you were able to compartmentalize it and it was just a job, but it feels like there's some of that connective tissue that resides in some of the emotional issues.
I don't think that part is compartmentalizable, right? Because learning a language is not like learning math. Like language. I'm reading a book on like by the godfather of linguistics, and he says that language is inherently interdependent upon others, right? You speaking does not matter unless someone else hears it. Just anything I could say, it doesn't matter. It doesn't count as language unless someone else hears it. So that's part of it. And then the other part is that in order to learn a language well, if you know Spanish, if you know Italian, right? Italians, they talk with their hands. That yeah, it's a thing that we make fun of people, but like it's true. It is a necessary part of their speech, right? Word order matters. Like all these things, learning the culture of you have to learn culture to learn language. It's absolutely true. You cannot learn language in a vacuum, and so that means that you have to understand those people. And so the nature of the job would thereby prevent compartmentalization, right? Because you just can't. It's hardwired into the job of the language that the people who speak that language.
Yeah, pretty fascinating. By the way, from 100% Italian, I know what you're talking about. So you didn't offend me. Don't worry about it. Yeah, I mean, I guess too, with the book, give me some more just, overarching themes within the book that you felt were necessary for the audience to
know. Learning language is it's an old proverb in many, many communities. Learning language is like gaining another soul. It's very true. If you can even learn 10% of another language, you should do it. It'll change your life. It's incredible. As much as maybe, especially the latter half of this conversation sounds, negative, very negative even.
It's real. It's not negative. It's just reality. It's not part of our job. It's part of what we do. You can't escape it at this point,
But so joining the Air Force is the best decision I ever made in my life. And, the second best decision I ever made was getting out. I'm not saying everybody should have to get out even a little bit, but I think if you know that kind of going into the book, you might not necessarily fall prey to there's a fair amount of ranting and that sort of stuff, but that's just part and parcel of it. That overwhelmingly joining the military changed my life in ways that I would never undo. I would, some people have asked me, would you go back and not join, but 100% not. I would absolutely do it because it changed my life in a lot of ways that I think are just important to who I've become as a human. And so if nothing else, the book is technically it's a memoir, right? Technically it's a war story, but it isn't really either of those things. It just happens to be about a small part of a person's life, predominantly in the middle of a war.
Yeah. And I will say this much, and you say, talk about culture and language and everything else. And again, just my experience in Iraq, I can't tell you, I can remember vividly when, remember I told you earlier about how I started picking up language and context and was able to speak it enough to, I can remember, the more and more I started to show the Iraqis that I was working with that I could speak their language. The easier it was for them to relate to me as a person. It breaks down tons of barriers. I'll never forget. I literally, at the end of a meeting, I went through 2 full sentences of where I wanted them to be, when the next meeting was, what time, what day, and everything else. And I said it all in Arabic right to them. And every one of the Iraqis went, their eyes popped out of their head, like they were just totally taken aback by the whole thing.
Right.
I'll never forget. My interpreter looked at me and said, "Okay, sir, I quit. I go home now." Because it was just, but it was that moment. It was that moment where they connected with me as a person. It stopped being about my rank. It stopped being about my job. It stopped being about me being an American per se. It just came about me and them as people. And I think that connective tissue in language is through this conversation is sort of, reaffirmed in my head that means a lot to people because you're investing time in them and who they are and where they come from.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that word is so good. Investing, right? I'm not saying that sitting down, and I don't claim this in the book, sitting down and talking to the Taliban wasn't going to make the Taliban not the Taliban, right? Again, real bad ideology, real bad. They don't believe in educating girls. They believe in insane punishments for all kinds of stuff. They don't believe in music. It's ridiculous. But, and sitting down and talking to them and figuring out like what is going on, maybe they just like don't want to kill you as much. That seems a better outcome to me. That like people want to kill each other a little bit less in the world.
Yeah. Again, it's crazy. And the story is fantastic. And I thank you for telling it to us. I really, really do. And again, title of the book, What the Taliban Told Me. I'm sure you can get it anywhere. And, check out the articles in The Atlantic that you wrote, what I learned while eavesdropping on the Taliban, what I learned while hunting humans. I think those are certainly very, very important pieces for people to understand a little bit more. And, you can get the book everywhere, I assume, audiobook, all sorts of forms.
Yeah, I narrated the audiobook, so you can listen to my dulcet tones.
Yes, there you go. Did I lose you? What happened? You still there? Okay. Mm-hmm. Pause for a second. I again, what the Taliban told me, I'm excited to read it. I'm excited to go through it. I think that there is, a certain level of the humanity is what's really kind of drawing me in, because it's not often we spend a lot of time in this, and it's not often we spend a lot of time in this from somebody who's been there. It's easy to write, books about humanity when you haven't seen the depravity of it. It's hard to write books about humanity when you've lived through it and have a firsthand perspective of it. So genuinely appreciate your time. Wish you nothing but the best going forward. Take care of you, man. Where are you now with all the mental health stuff? How are you feeling?
Oh, I'm significantly better. I eventually got some very good therapists, and I have a lot of wonderful humans in my life who support me. So, I'm way better.
Does it feel reconciled for you to a certain extent?
No. This is like because I love words and I'm focused on words all the time. But the idea of reconcile or closure, it's closed loop somehow that it's over and it's done. I have a hint that the way you talk about it, like Iraq will never be over for you. Afghanistan will never be over for me. It's not a thing that ended for my brain, I guess. That said, like I don't wake up screaming too often anymore. Right? Like I can't.
Right. You know what it is though, and I'll add one more thought. And this creeps in time from time. What you're not over is what the war did to you. It's not that I'm not over the moments. It's not that I'm not over the things that I experienced. It's not that I don't have closure on decisions that were made, right? We talk about, hey, I just got that guy killed or whatever, or I just shot somebody. It's not those moments. It's just what you don't get over is that you're still mourning the loss of who you were, right? And that is something.
Or mourning like who you became. I think for a lot of people.
Well, yeah. And adjusting to who you've become, right? And understanding who that person is. So I think that's that's the other part of it. But again, what the Taliban told me, great stuff. Ian, certainly appreciate your time. Wishing you nothing but the best. Great success with the book going forward. And certainly, if you're writing another one, let's have you back and then we'll discuss that one as well. But I certainly appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Ian Fritz, thanks for being part of the Hazard Ground.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground podcast, hosted by Mark Zinno. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at producer@hazardground.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.